Hello, digital educator, and welcome to this video that is entitled "To Increase Student Access, Use Fewer Words." Now, this is set up kind of like a Christopher Nolan movie here, in that not only is it just the title, but it's also the solution. In the end, this is what we'll arrive back at. So we're starting at the end and coming back through. So this concept of student access is one that is absolutely paramount to those individuals that have disabilities, those that have diversities in learning styles and diversity in access, as well as to make sure that we can attain our students' achievement to the greatest extent possible. And we're going to talk about one of those very such strategies that's pretty simple, but it's something that we don't ever think about. So to get into the right frame here about what we're going to learn about, I want you to think about a Jolly Rancher. And yes, I very specifically chose the cherry because it's a very unique flavor. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about if you were to convey to someone that had never eaten a Jolly Rancher before, how would you tell them that it tastes? Would you be able to describe this Jolly Rancher in enough detail that if they tasted that Jolly Rancher at some point, at some period thereafter, that they'd be able to say, oh yes, this is definitely what you described? Think about that for a second. Now, let's say you use the word, well, it's tart. Oh, you mean tart like a lemon? No, it doesn't taste like a lemon. Well, it's sugary and sweet. Sugary and sweet like maple syrup? No, it's got more of a citrusy taste, so kind of like an orange. There really is no flavor that it experiences just the quite same way that a Jolly Rancher cherry is. So it's difficult because we're having to try to take these sensory experiences and trying to put them into language, which is not at all the way that our brain works. Our brain is functioning in a manner that we're constantly taking in this stimuli, and we're storing stimuli in various parts of our brain. But we don't store words. We store sounds, we store feelings and thoughts and things that we sense, each of the five senses, smells, etc. And we're hardwired into that. But when you think about language, it's such an abstraction from the natural world that's around us. In means to attempt to communicate, we make things incrementally more difficult. So to think about that, we cannot transfer a sensation from one person to the next person to have them feel that. One of those sci-fi movies where you touch someone, a Stephen King movie, I forget which one it is now, where you touch someone and they can feel all of the things that you felt. The Green Mile, I guess? Yeah. And we can't do that. So we attempt to use language and words in order to convey those. And the non-exact nature of language can make things more difficult. You could use 10,000 words to explain what a Jolly Rancher means, but you could also do the same thing in 3 seconds by just popping it into your mouth. And it would not be the exact same thing of what you described. So when we think about even more difficult beyond just language and trying to use words to convey what's going on is the concept of reading. Now, what we have here is the work of Stanislas Dehaene, who is a neuroscientist, a cognitive neuroscientist from France, who studies reading in the brain specifically. Now, what this is happening, what's showing you here is the gap in between the two light ups there is just before the start of when the brain starts reading. So as we look here, it starts. We start in the back, which is your visual cortex. When we have those visual stimuli that excite the brain, it then notices the fact that it's going to be a visual word form, this area right in here that they call the letter box or the visual word form area. At that point, for reading to happen, it goes two parallel routes. It tries to go up into here, so which is the phonology, what does the word that you're reading look like? And at the same point, it's going up to the front of the brain, which is associated with meaning, those things that we've experienced. So trying to take all of these sensory experiences, linking them together to make a language system. Now, the spoken language, we have sounds that we associate with the meaning that goes up inside of here. And then if you think about it, the visual part of reading, the letters, the words, are no more than just visual stimuli, that we're attempting to link all of these things in together. We're taking this corpus of spoken words, this stimuli of sound, and link it to stimuli of vision for then to make a connection about what things mean. And the thing that's most striking about his research, as he did these brain scans of people as they're reading, is that there is no one area that's responsible for reading. There are many areas that are responsible for reading. And that's what makes reading so difficult, because if you think about all of the folds in the sections of the brain and the gray matter that is in between these areas, that if the gray matter ends up becoming, or the gray tissue becomes damaged in between one of those lobes, that's where we get reading disabilities that are come into it, because those neural pathways that we're trying to create are unable to go through that region and have to rework around through the brain. So instead of just going to one part of the brain when we use language, it's going all over the place, just to show how incrementally abstract and how difficult language really is. And we don't appreciate that enough. So to best explain what I was just talking about here, with the process of reading, you have your visual cortex where all the visual stimuli come in, goes in the letter word form area where it starts breaking those things off into the meaning here, and also the sound, the phonology of the words. All of these things spreading across the brain like a tidal wave of electricity of going through the neurons, the neuronal pathways that are going on. So yeah, it is incredibly complex and difficult to engage in reading, and just the process of language, period, to try to convey something that could be as simple as just the taste of a Jolly Rancher is going to take so much sensory input and organization, consolidation of knowledge, and activation of that prior knowledge in order just to describe the most minute sense. So, from Science Advances, this quote here really starts to give us a knowledge about how the brain works and why it's so difficult. So brain shape, which we have right now and we associate with the modern brain, evolved gradually within the Homo sapiens lineage, reaching present-day human variation between about 100,000 and 35,000 years ago. And some people say it's about 40,000 years ago that the modern brain, as we know it today, was established. So 40,000 years ago, that is just a speck of time in the history of this world, but 40,000 years is also a great amount of time when we consider the fact that writing, the cuneiform script, cuneiform I should say, that was created in Mesopotamia, which is present-day Iraq, was created circa 3,200 BC, and that's the first alphabetic writing system, so that's about 5,000 years old. So the modern brain existed for approximately 30,000 years before writing could even be conceived of, could even be thought of. And that's because writing is not, and reading is not a natural process of the brain. That spoken language and conveying thoughts through language that's oral is a very natural process. Kids learn how to talk without having to be explicitly taught how to talk. We teach them words, we teach them concepts in their talk, but they develop the ability to talk without having to sit down and having a set scope and a sequence. Reading is completely opposite of that because it is not a natural process. It is something that we have to very much intentionally pick up, this intense abstraction, and also the fact that it's changing the brain. Now, Dehane, who had already talked about with those images of the fMRI of the brain that's going on in reading, they took a group of people to compare their brains, those of literate people and illiterate people, and then also another set of people that were illiterate and then became literate after that point, former illiterates as they called them. And the researchers found the people who had learnt, yes, this came from Europe, so learnt is proper there, to read early in life, a smaller region of the left occipital temporal cortex responded to images of faces than in the illiterate volunteers. So as we go back here to this image of the brain, the visual word form area, this is the part where we start looking at letters and we start looking at bigrams, two letters that go in together here to process them, to correlate back into sound. Now, what they're finding in their research is that as people were becoming literate, that this area went from being used to recognizing shapes and recognizing faces. And as they started to read, all of that processing that went in this left hemisphere, which the left hemisphere is a powerhouse of reading in the brain, is that it no longer could use this occipital temporal lobe, this visual word form area, for that function of faces and shapes anymore, and that was pushed over to the right hand side of the brain. The entire brain was rewired because of the fact that we're trying to learn language and we're trying to learn reading in the written form. And so it is no wonder the fact that writing is so difficult, because we are rearranging the brain when we're teaching kids how to read. And that is absolutely astounding. And we forget that. We forget just how complex language is and how much language adds to the difficulty of the tasks that we ask kids to do. Now, as an example here, say to you, how many words would it take you to tell someone how to get to a shared drive? I think it would probably take about 500 words. You could be brief, and maybe you could get it down to about 100 words. So for me to go from my memory here, I could say, well, you need to go to google.com. Then once you're at google.com, you want to look for the waffle that's up in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. The waffle looks like a 3x3 array that you click on, and then from there your apps will fall down, and then from the apps falling down, you're going to look for this triangle that kind of looks like the triangle that Amish use on their buggy. It's multicolored like a rainbow, and that's a Google Drive. In fact, it'll say Drive underneath it. So you click onto that triangle, which will take you to Google Drive. And after that point, you want to get to a shared drive. So over in the left-hand pane, which is over the farthest you could get left, and it takes up about 1/5 of the screen there. You're going to look for something that says shared. And when you click on that shared, it's going to bring up all of your shared drives. And then we're going to look for this shared drive that we're talking about, which in this case would be the ACA drive. How many words was that to explain this concept? And I contend the fact that we don't need those many words. We need just 4 boops, as I call them. Boop, 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 boop. And this GIF here helped to illustrate that fact as it starts over again. We're at google.com. We don't even have to go through and explain that you go to google.com and what google.com looks like, because we have that visual memory, that stimuli that's already been burned into our brain that we've stored about what is Google. Even though you have that fancy artwork that comes up all the time, now we also have this sensory image about where this is. When I say upper right hand, does it mean all the way up in here? Does it mean part way down? And then at that point, you get that shape of what that 3x3 array is, the waffle. And then there's the triangle I was talking about. All these words that I have to use to accurately convey to make sure you get there on time aren't needed when we simply just go with base core expression of stimuli, instead of trying to put all these things into words. Because what happens when we put all these things into words is that we start messing with what's known as the cognitive load theory. Cognitive load has 3 parts. You have your effective load, which you want to maximize. This is the things that you want to learn, the things that you already know that you're bringing to the table. Next, you have the ineffective load. These are the things that detract away from your ability to learn. This could be the environment that's around you. In directions, this could be language and using so many words to explain what it is that you want. And next, we have the task difficulty load, which, you look over at the other two. Effective load, we want to make go up. We want to activate that prior knowledge. We want to learn the content that's being presented. Effective load, we want this to go down. We want to make sure that we're taking away all those factors that detract away from the ability to learn. And then finally, we have task difficulty. To some extent, we can control our curriculum and how difficult the task is going to be. But if you're aspiring to a standard level of content, then sometimes this cannot be manipulated, which is why you don't have either of those arrows there. But again, as we integrate language into these things, you're detracting away from the ability to remember. So the more that we have this down here of this ineffective load, and the more that we increase task difficulty, then effective load is not going to reach its maximum potential. So to give an example about this, when we talk about using language versus using core stimuli and things that we don't have to transcode and encode into language, the Civil War. I go back to my 8th grade experience, Miss McAloon at the time, and she could talk about the brutality of how horrible the Civil War was and just how gruesome and how many people died, but those are just words. And then one day she shows the movie Glory, and if you remember the movie Glory at all, in the first 10 minutes we see an incredibly gruesome scene where a soldier is decapitated by a cannonball. What would have taken 20 minutes to describe in detail was achieved in just 5 seconds of video. And it sticks with me to this day. Now, 25 years later. And so with that, we need to try to take language out to the greatest extent possible so that we can lower the ineffective load and to raise our effective load. This sometimes may be known as the extraneous or load, and this is the germane load, but we want to take that extraneous stimuli and cut it down. So as we look here about how we actually store memory when it comes to the content, we have sensory input, which I've talked a lot about in this video. Then we have our short-term memory, our sensory memory that goes over into our working memory. Any things that we're not paying attention to, which has to do with our extraneous load of the cognitive load theory, it's lost. We're not paying attention, it goes through. But those things that we are paying attention to go into our working memory or our short-term memory. We have to do things with those short-term memories in order to make sure that they get encoded and stored into long-term memories. There's a lot of memory devices that we can go about this, but this video isn't about memory. It's about how do we make sure that we don't have impediments that get in the way of our ability to create those memories. And so a lot of times we have these experiences that just recall naturally. If you've ever been somewhere and you heard a song and it just brings back that sensation of a time and a place, and you feel those things that you felt at that time, because the core sense of that sensory input, it's not like someone else was telling you about the experience that you had in your 8th grade dance when the song Truly Madly Deeply came on. It's actually the experience of those things. And so taking the language out of it. Now, we have to work a lot harder with encoding and retrieval when it comes to our storage of concepts as they relate to the use of language. When we have to store them in language, then we make it more difficult to remember those things instead of using core, simplified, the essence of stimuli. And the more stuff that we don't go over often, we forget those things. And so, with that, I come back to where we started. To increase student access, I tell you, use fewer words. Where you can record yourself, where you can record audio, you can record video, where you can use GIFs, just like what happened here just before, or where we can go through and illustrate with images. We're not just going to provide for those individuals that have disabilities, because one of the greatest disabilities that we do have for students is those of literacy disabilities. But what we're also going to do is we're going to create an on-ramp for all learners, how we learn best, how we receive stimuli and process stimuli for the tasks and for the learning that we wish to have. And so I tell you, if you want to make learning that reaches everyone, if it wants to provide greater student access, if we want to increase achievement, simple. Just use fewer words.